Uh, so hey, this is Ranjit. I think Ajay has already told you what I do or what I have done. I work currently for PagerDuty, and I'll be talking or discussing and debating about resiliency. So in the agenda of this particular talk will be what resiliency means, what kind of tools we have currently, how much resilient applications we can build in what context, what kind of cultures we can, what kind of cultural learnings we have learned while building a resilient teams or resilient applications. So the talks or the slides have only the bullet points, but I'll give concrete examples of at each slide. So if you want, you can take notes, or you can ask me, you can catch me offline, and you can talk about any particular point in detail. So some context. So PagerDuty is an alert dispatching system, or you can think of a 911 or 100 dial system. If something goes wrong with any one of your IT systems, you can send an alert, or generally people tend to monitor their systems. Those monitoring systems sends alerts to us, and we dispatch those alerts. So what they do is that they a priori set up their people that, okay, I have 5 operations people, or I have 6 developers, and they'll be on call from this time to this time. And if any one of our system goes down, they send the alert to us, and we send calls to them on those individual people who are on call rotation. If one of them is not available, we follow the escalation policy, and whatever the next person is available, we'll call them. Even if you picked up the call and if you don't acknowledge, or it will time out, that we treat them as an unacknowledged call, and again we retry them. The nature of our business makes it very important that we are highly resilient to failures. This also means that when some failure occurs, we experience an exponentially large load, right? A large part of our customer base or client base is based on AWS cloud or other clouds, and when that goes down, we have to dispatch their alerts. That means we have to run our infrastructure also on multiple clouds. So that means we try to run a resilient infrastructure and resilient applications on top of it into multiple clouds. And that's why I think those some of our learnings can be of some help to you guys. So exactly what is resiliency? There are a lot of similar terms around the same concepts. One of them is HA, or high availability. What HA means is that you have 2 servers, and if one of them goes down, the other one takes over. Now this is a very crude way of explaining HA, or high availability. You can have the similar notion across multiple cases. You can have it in WebTile, you can have it in database, you can have it in DNS, depending upon your business. You can have. But this is not only resilience. This is one particular type of resilient system. You have another term called disaster recovery. What happens? Some disaster happens. How you recover from there, right? And you can design that. You might not have a very HA application or highly available application. Suppose you run a microblogging site. So if the microblogging site goes down, nobody's really life is going to be hampered, or it's not really a very very important thing. It is fine to recreate if the system becomes available after 15 minutes, right? You can deal with it. It's not really that bad. So it may not be HA, but it has a better DR system. Fast you can provision and recreate the entire thing. That is also another part of resiliency. What other kind of resilience you can have? You can have totally failure from other factors, external. So you have your clients or customers, and you have your services running on another end, and something in between broke. Then you are not available. This is also another aspect of resilience. So in general computer science we call it network partition. What if the network between you and me got partitioned? How you deal with that? That is also a concern that we address in resiliency. Third thing of malused. What if some people hack you? Try to make a brute force attack. Anybody who runs PHP application, they know how much PHP security threats or vectors are there in the wild. Especially if you are running MySQL or typical LAMP stack. The most widely attacked probably tech stack there. What other kinds of, this is so security threat and mitigation of them, and stay resistant to those security threats in the wild is also a part of resiliency. Another way of thinking resiliency will be, say you give APIs, right? We have API and other folks here. So what if your client use your API and by mistake they wrote something that storms. They are writing some scripts that in a for loop calls your system. But you serve to multiple clients, but one client has taken down your website. Can you stay resilient to that kind of issues? So there are a large spectrum of problems or a large spectrum of vectors that can cause failures. Irrespective of what kind of we are dealing or who is causing it, there are in general 3 or 4 categories. We can categorize in 3 basic or broad categories that how failures are introduced in the systems. First and foremost is human error. It can be a design error, it can be something by mistake, but as long as you have human processes involved, we'll have human related errors, and those are one major chunk of failures in our system. So when you are designing resilient systems, we have to think that there are multiple ways we can address how we can reduce human intervention or manual intervention, or in general how we can reduce the scope of human errors. Second thing is application error. I will go through each of these topics in detail, but the application error means you have written some bug, right? So you have some edge cases that you have not probably tested, right? One way of testing application or mitigating application error is by extensive testing. You can have unit testing, which probably not the best thing to catch errors, but to enforce better design, and we know by virtue a better design will lead to less error, right? So, but you can also have functional testing, you can have integration testing, right? You can have regression testing, so known bugs are not appear. Also, you can have other kinds of testing to accommodate application error. I'll talk about something called compartmentalizing stuff and letting them failing independently. Those are things that you can do to mitigate application error. Third type of vectors or third category of failures are from external sources. Things like an external network hops gone, somebody storming it, right? Things like nowadays a lot of people do continuous delivery. They try to deploy directly from an artifact server. Suppose you are a Java shop and you pull something, pull the var from a continuous integration system. Or suppose you are deploying something like a Rails or PHP or Python app. So you take the stuff directly from GitHub and you deploy it from there. What if GitHub is unavailable? What if something between you and GitHub is not available? What if GitHub has a security issue and they have blacklisted your SSH keys? In that case, probably GitHub at a large is available, but you are not able to pull that code. These things you cannot really test, right? And this is also external. So this also causes a large set of failures. So among all of these things, there is a one common thing, and that is that probably you will never be able to address all of them. One key thing we have learned is that we have to change our mindset from resisting failure to accepting them. There is no way we can say that our application will never fail. The best, though it is very good to try and build them such a way that they fail less. I mean, there is no known failure modes, right? Try to. So if you have 100, like beyond this load, my application fails. So how can I reduce that? This is one kind of approach, and it is really nice if you work on those things. But at given amount of time or at given any state, you know beyond this load my application will fail, right? How you act when your load goes beyond that, or when your usage goes beyond that. So a paradigm shift here we are experiencing is that to accept those failures and see that how we can mitigate them, or what we can do when the things have failed. So, and that leads to the second topic is that how we can design application for resilient. So from now onwards, every time I'll talk about resilient design or resilient application, I'll talk about failures and how we can recover from failures rather than how we can avoid failures. The entire talk will not really discuss how we can avoid failures. Failures happen, we know that. And there are well-known ways that you can reduce the scope of failure, testing and other stuff is like that. One first thing we have learned after post-cloud and all those things, ephemeral everything. The first on this ephemeral methodology is that your infrastructure is ephemeral. The EC2 instance you are running, the Rackspace instance you are running, try to nuke it, even if you don't need it, after a certain time. Why? And I'll say why soon after, but infrastructure is one component that you want to make ephemeral. By infrastructure I mean your storage, your SAN and all those things. your compute devices, that means actual physical servers, that the application server, web server, load balancers, database servers, and finally the networks. Try to make them ephemeral. Why? In general, if you look at the technical community or technical stacks, everything is changing rapidly. So today you start with your development. In 3 months later, you have one stable release of Linux. In 6 months down the line, you'll have another major release of the distro that you are using. Nobody uses straight away from kernel here, right? We all build something on top of a distribution. That distribution changes. Now, you may use a long-term supported version. But remember one thing: when a security vulnerability is already announced, before that time you are not very prone to that threat. But once it is out there in the wild, you are very, very prone to that. And one very good way to get to adjust those kind of security threats is that you constantly upgrade to the latest version. Now, definitely, you cannot go to the bleeding edge version because things might break or things will break. So there are some testing involved. So as a result, by the time the latest versions comes and you test and you adopt them, there will be gap. And that gap should never cross the gap between next major security release. That means don't build something that just to migrate that thing. So I have built an application on Lucid, say Ubuntu 10.04, and just to migrate that application from Ubuntu 10.12.04 will take me 2 years. If that is the case, then that's a flaw. It is very difficult to make that kind of application resilient, because then I am always chasing it's like a chicken and egg problem. By the time you have fixed the migration or adjusted to the migration, another version has come, lot of security vulnerability has exposed, and none of them will be available for your distribution. So this is one thing. Even if you don't need, you keep on constantly. And same on the persistent layer. You might think that persistent layers like, say, your Cassandra nodes, your database, Oracle, or MS SQL, or MySQL servers, you don't have to, I have noticed that a lot of people try to make ephemeral on the web server layers or the load balancer layers, but not on the persistent store layer. It is very important to make those things ephemeral. Why? Because those things actually break, right? But the moment you try to think of making them ephemeral, you know that this thing has states, right? So when you migrate one server to another one, not only that you have to recreate the server, but you also have to restore the backups, right? And this particular thing has to be automated, or maybe semi-automated, or maybe manual, right? But more you practice, more you make it ephemeral, more you practice, and more you practice, more you good, right? And all these tools, all these database technologies, they also change. So if 6 months down the line, there is a new backup tools, there are new improvements happen, you get to adjust to that. You can incorporate small changes to catch up with those upstream version. And above everything, this gives you some understanding that what it takes to do this. Initially it will be hard, maybe in the first time it will be like 8 months, 1 year maybe, but then you can go for 6 months. Then you can go to 3 months, then probably you can go to 1 month or whatever. It is fine to have it 1 year, but still the thinking that in 1 year I want to change this thing. So every time you spawn up something, be it service, be it infrastructure, think that this is going to go after this time. So have that TTL or time to live kind of mentality for everything, including the code you write. Most of the code that we write, we try to rewrite it over the time. If you are not rewriting it, it means either it is super solid or it means we have a tech debt there. That means we cannot just change it because probably we don't have the human resource or technical know-how to do so. Another problem is that a lot of people think that to build anything resilient, to build anything ephemeral, it has to be automated. It don't have to be, not necessarily. There are several cases where you can do things manually. And in most cases, you'll start with manual stuff. Go with manual, see that what risk it takes, and you can afford that risk. Then, among the entire manual workflow, try to figure out the chunk that can be easily automated. Once you have done that, you have reduced greatly the time required to transition from one ephemeral system to another ephemeral system. And you have the semi-automatic system. The good part about it is that now anybody can look at that tool and the documentation, which is now much less, right? And can repeat it and improve upon it. Later in the slide, I'll talk about what kind of properties you need to build those kind of tools that these tools can be used to build a much larger automation tool. And it is absolutely possible. The thing that you build to do some POC, small POC work, if you stick to at least 3 basic properties, probably you'll be able to use it. Even in large scheme of things, all POC code can go to production. If you adhere to 3 basic principles, and then definitely design things can be addressed by refactoring and all those things. So automation is an asymptotic phenomenon. At any point of time, you will never have 100% automation. If you are 100% automation, that means your technology stack is not evolving. How it is possible? You are adapting new technology and it is already automated, right? Once you adopt it, then you will be automating how to deal with it. So start doing things manually. Once you have done the manual, see what kind of tools can be done to build the repeated works, and then build semi-automatic workflows, and then try to exploit that to build further system. One key thing to remember when you are building in the second stage, the smaller chunks. So say for example, I want to make my MySQL servers ephemeral. So what does that mean? Means every 3 months I want to recreate the MySQL server. So probably the first thing I'll do is manually, after 3 months I'll manually create the MySQL server, then take the dump from the production server, and then I'll use MySQL restore to put the dump. In the semi-automatic workflow, what I'll do that probably I'll do the first the taking the dump and restoring the dump, automatic, because it is very easy, and push it in a regular interval in some storage system. But creating the MySQL server is manual. But when you are creating the earlier 2 tools, remember you don't introduce something that stops them, that blocks them from chained with another tool. If you can do that, you can build higher level tools on top of it. Is it clear? Okay. Now I'll talk about actually specific technical stuff, like what kind of tools, what kind of options we have in traditional application architectures. Only applications, not infrastructure necessarily. I'm assuming most of you work on the internet, right? Or you expose or consume services on top of internet. You may not. In that case, it may not be very relevant, but you may be able to draw, similar stuff. First, in application tier, right? By application tier means when your client or your customer hits your service, the first thing they experience is your application tier, right? In oftentimes, it is front-ended by load balance and other stuff like that. But ideally, think from your perspective, even to touch that part, they go through multiple other services that you don't host or maybe you don't control, but they go through that. Like, say you are doing Google search, the first thing you hit is not Google server. You hit your DNS server, your ISP's DNS server, to figure out what is www.google.com and what's its IP, right? You can introduce resiliency right there. DNS-based resiliency or DNS-based high availability or DNS-based failover mechanisms are available. What kind of options we have? In mail systems, we have MX, where you can give multiple records with different order. So if one fails, the next one with higher weightage will be picked up. So you have like 3 mail. I have say foobar.com and I have mailing system. So I can have 3 mail servers, 3 MX record, say x.foobar, mail1.foobar.com, mail2.foobar.com, mail3.foobar.com. Mail 1 has 10 weightage, mail 2 20, and mail 3 30. When user hits, the first one he'll try is 10 because it has the smallest weight. So these things are offered by SMTP or by MX protocols, and you can exploit that. This is only for mail servers, but remember this is available for normal HTTP based stuff also. Normal A record lookup. You can have multiple A records. x.y.com can resolve to 10 IPs, and each of them can be this thing. But the problem is that the HTTP protocol does not enforce clients to entertain all of them. So if the first one is it attacks or it tries to connect and it's not able to connect, it might or might not fail over to the next one. It is entirely on the client. It is not enforced by the protocol. But hey, there is another solution. There is something called GSLB, Global Service Load Balancing, where you can tell your DNS provider that I have a service running on which caters to www.foobar.com, and there are 3 IPs that can cater, and you can hit in these services with /status, and if it gives the 200, you entertain its IP. That means if any one of these boxes go down, those IPs will be automatically removed from your DNS names. This is called GSLB. So the point I'm trying to make is that as of now, the client still has not reached to your application tier or your stack, but still you have already provided some form of resiliency, right? This particular form of resiliency, DNS-based, work perfectly for geographic or network partitions. You can have active clusters in large, I can run stuff in India and Singapore and Japan, and even if the entire network from Singapore is gone, people from other places can take the Japan or India web servers or servers to cater their use cases. Second thing is persistent tier. By persistent tier, most people from the traditional RDBMS school will think that you have master-master or master-slave replication, right? You can have passive slaves, you can have delayed read-only slaves, and all those kind of things. What it means that you have one master and you have multiple slaves for that. Once the master goes down, you promote the slave to be a master. This is one. MySQL provides this. Pretty much everyone provides this. You can also do multi-master system. What does that mean? You have two masters. If any one of them goes off, this is automatically master. You don't have to do anything. The thing is that to work this kind of technology, the client has to be aware of for some aspects of it. This is multi-master way. But there are even better alternatives. You can probably reduce the data that is stored in MySQL and offload those data that does not require proper RDBMS or SQL kind of linear algebra kind of stuff. You can push them into key value stores, and then there you have a lot other options. Key value stores like Redis, like Riak, like Cassandra, they provide a wide variety of options. You can have you have masterless, so there is no master. In Cassandra, you can put 10 Cassandra nodes, any one of them can go down, right? And still your whole cluster is available. They cannot tackle network partitions, but they can deal with one node failure or one server failure, and it is still available. This is persistent tier. I'll talk about again more in detail. Remember, both application and persistence tier, right? Resilient design that I'm talking about assumes that you have a distributed system. I'll talk in general about what are the options we have in general in distributed system. That is Paxos, Raft, two-phase commit systems, and all those things. In the persistent tier, both MySQL as well as if you look at the next generation SQL systems like NewSQL or Cassandra, or there is something called Zookeeper or etcd. Those are not exactly databases, but they help you build coordinations. What it means is that you have two systems. One is active, one is passive, right? And when this one active goes down, by default the passive system cannot accept writes. It can only probably take reads, right? But if this one goes down, you can say that now you are active, right? But to tell this thing, you need a very different kind of algorithm. And that algorithms can be provided by systems like Zookeeper, etcd, all this. These are called consensus building. So you have 10 nodes, and among 10 nodes, one of them can accept write because that is a master. But when that goes down, you have to select a new master. How you select a master? If there are 10 nodes, so they have to agree on consensus. Who provides that consensus is built on that. Gossip protocol also provides some lights on those things. We'll see more detail how you can manage these things. Maybe direct tools like Cassandra, Zookeeper, and adopt them, or you can look at the protocol, look at the algorithms that they use to give you high available or highly resilient system, and how you can incorporate those similar methodology in your application design. That means your application now does gossip. So your web server has like 10 workers, and all of them gossips among each other and stay highly available, right? So suppose you have done a distributed system, right? And they are very highly resilient, right? Still you have certain other kinds of concern. Remember one golden rule: every time you incorporate or introduce a new tool to address something, you also open up certain new failure modes, right? So the only time they make sense if the new failure modes are less. So I have say a failure which I have probability of happening like say 20%, and to address that I am introducing a new technology, right? But the new technology also comes with its own set of failures, and that failure case should be significantly less, maybe 2% or 1%, right? But still, what are those 2% failure that can happen, right? One of them is cascading failure. One of our recent experience was, we run our infrastructure on these technologies, right? The persistent store, a lot of stuff on Cassandra, a lot of stuff on Zookeeper. Our application understands that who is currently our master database from Zookeeper, that kind of information. What if the Zookeeper master dies? It automatically selects another one. But during that time, none of the Zookeeper nodes can accept anything. So all the web servers that was connecting to Zookeeper, right, for that fraction of time will not be available. So this is called cascading failure. So you have built a distributed system that is fault tolerant, and you have another system that cannot tolerate fault, but that can just talk to this one. And because it push all the states here, if the underlying system is fault tolerant, the whole system is fault tolerant. But when failure happen, there is some time of unavailability, and that particular failure should not cascade. Individual components must fail independently. So what we did is that we put some process supervision. If you are aware of something like God, Bluepill, Monit, they can listen to a particular socket, or they can supervise a particular process and see if it is working or not. If it is not working, they can restart them. So we did the same thing for Zookeeper and Cassandra. But every time the Zookeeper will fail, for some time it will go unavailable. Monit will try to restart it. But the thing is, that is natural. For some time it will be unavailable. That is very sub-second. But Monit is already, the moment Monit realizes that it is unavailable, it starts restarting it, making the failure prolonged. And that was another thing. So every time you push automation, so we had pushed automation thinking that if our server goes down, more Monit will bring it up. But we didn't thought that there was another vector. So if Zookeeper fails, it must not trigger failures in other mode. And that we had not designed initially. Now we have it. Now we have addressed it. So this is another very key learning. So every time the lesson learned is that every time you introduce automation, you are actually looking forward new failure modes. The reason I am not emphasizing on a lot of automation, remember it is very important, because we have, this is like the third DevOps days, and we have repeatedly talked about that human errors are there, we need more and more automation. So probably it's also a good time to think about what if you automate and what kind of failures can come. So automation will increase failures as well. It will reduce some of them, but it introduce new ones. Components must fail independently. Doesn't matter where it is. That means your persistent database, if it is failing, it should not propagate failures to other systems. If your web servers are failing, let it fail, but it should not propagate to other systems. This is very, very crucial if you are designing something like a microservices. So generally we build microservices assuming that you have individual services serving only one part of a large user workflow, and you have a large set of them, making a full-blown application. But what if one of them fail? Can the other one work? What if it does not work? How your user will be, user experience will matter. Will it go completely blank? Will it get a 500? Remember one thing, at any point of time you don't want to give 500. Any point of time. 500x means something wrong happened on your end. Even if you have not been able to do anything, still don't give 500. Say that you have failed. But that is a valid, legit 200 HTTP response. You can have a dedicated page called status saying that you are out, right? But giving 500 means, so this is the crucial. Giving 500 means that not only that you have been able to contain, you have failed to contain your failures, you have also propagating it to another one. So that is a very, very key design thinking. That it is fine to fail for you, but it is not fine to propagate the failure to your clients. And the same thing happens even in the service structure. So contain failure. Then the next question arises, how we can contain failures? You can have multiple ways of containing failure. Suppose you have two processes, one upstream, one downstream, this one depends upon that, and this one has failed. The first thing this one can do is that it can hit multiple. Remember the DNS example? So there are multiple protocols which supports that. Thrift is one of them. Think of classic Memcache client. They can understand multiple servers. You don't have to use exactly those, But when you are designing some application, you can think of that my downstream service is not available. I can hit another one. Probably I'll make a DNS request and I'll see if there's other IPs are available. Can I exploit that? So this is your containment. Second thing is that hit cache. You will give stale data. Hit cache. But remember, maybe it's not possible for you to give stale data, but for 99% of the use cases, you can give stale data, right? So containing failures is another thing that you have to come, or you have to design that if I am building this thing, these are my integration points. What if my ABC among these three integration points, the first one fails? What are my contingent options, right? If you cannot at all contain, probably it's a bad idea to decouple them. That means they are coupled. That's a wrong abstraction you are building, if you cannot at all contain them. So we talked about that it will fail, you have to contain. Then what happens when you contain them? Definitely you don't have the information that you are getting from that service. So this gives to another phenomenon called degraded mode. You can run with the degraded mode. Now this is only one way to get degraded mode. You can have multiple degraded mode. I'll give you some of the concrete examples that we face day to day. We dispatch alerts, and as I said, when suppose AWS or Linode or some other network outage or some other cloud related outage happens, we get an exponential amount of this thing. Not only that, if some really bad system has been introduced, suppose you are writing some code and that will fail all your servers. So all your monitoring will go out, right? And all of them will send alert to us, right? And that causes failures at our end. So we run on degraded mode. The way we define degraded mode is that we'll start throttling you. So throttling is a degraded mode, right? Not from me. For me, to a certain extent, yes, it is a degraded mode. Ideally, I should be able to survive, cater infinite number of requests, right? But I'm not. It's theoretically impossible, right? So that is my degraded mode. On your side, you also know that if you throttle me certain, if you are sending me request above certain threshold, you will not get the response back, or probably will just deny it. So now we also enforcing another design principle that you on your side should able to contain failure on our side, right? Because from our side we cannot really realize that which one of them are legit request. Maybe all the among say 20,000 wrong alerts, one of them was right. But when we are throttling,
do you have a correlation mechanism where you figure out the correlation and
yes.
generate the exact alert?
Yeah, so remember the first thing. I'll come back to that again. You can have correlation,
Right.
and you can feedback that, but the whole thing will take time, right?
The correlation may not be on time, lifetime way you define it, but correlation also be when you actually configure the alerts, when you configure a system.
Yeah, and we can probably auto scale, right? Again, that is not instantaneous.
Yes, correct. I'm saying when you define the alerts, when you define the
Yes.
configuration to the system.
Yes, absolutely. Those mitigation strategies are ongoing. But what I'm trying to highlight is that even with your best efforts, you have to tackle this problem that you are having, right?
Can you just talk about how you do, what kind of correlations?
Yeah, I'll come to that.
In failure duty or whatever.
Sure, I'll come to that. So supporting degraded modes is another key trick. Not only from your side, and you can have degraded modes on your application, you can have degraded modes on your client things. By client bindings, I mean, we have something called webhooks. That means if you send an alert, you can say that every time I get this kind of alert, give me a callback on this particular web request. So think of that, you are monitoring your load or your HTTP request count. And when it goes to beyond certain point, you send us an alert. And you also put a webhook of auto scaling. So when the alert comes, we scale it for you. We trigger that webhook, and that webhook can do anything. That can probably wake up some people, that can probably do something, that can probably spawn new servers. It's up to you how you design. But that is another way to communicate that, yeah, we are doing it. And we can throttle there also. What if we start using that webhooks and we realize that's a bad webhooks? Probably you have designed a system and that system is not available, right? That can also happen. How I do it? I mean, here I have a scenario where I can probably, it's not exactly throttle. I can only complete half of the request, not full. This is legit case. You can happen. This can happen, and it is perfectly, as long as you are transparent and saying that this is the problem, and we cannot cater this thing because this is a stale request. This web API that we have given, it's not doesn't really work. So those are some form of degraded mode. Metrics for everything. Have metrics for everything. Things that you need, things that you don't need. Metrics are absolutely important. Now, when you talk about metrics, generally you think about, system load, disk CPU in the operations. In the applications, you can think of HTTP request, how many users count, things like BAM, business activity monitoring solutions, how long the user stays. Then you can go a little bit ahead and you can think of performance-wise. You can do instrumentation. You can say if you're running an MVC framework, you can say how much time spent on every controller. Increase or expand that particular phenomenon across all the automation suite. Everywhere you use code, everywhere. That means the tool that you use to restore MySQL backup, before it starts the backup, drop a metric that I am starting now, and by the time it finishes, drop another metric that I have finished now. This one will give you some understanding how long it takes to you to backup and how it is changing as your data is growing. This is important because when you really have to, because remember, you will not have full-blown automation in the beginning. So when you are doing semi-automatic mode, this gives you some estimate. You can have some estimate that, okay, at this time I am semi-automatic, but I have the data that when the things will break, it will take 1 hour for me to just to back up and restore it. And that particular information will let you design and estimate way more complicated workflows and address more other. Then you can basically build another set of tool, say I am doing cloud migration, but it is only possible for me to do in 2 hours because just the backup things takes 1 hour and stuff like that. So your daily use tools or anywhere you use code, you can use metrics there. Metrics not only for apps and tools, put metrics for integration also. None of us runs applications that are self-contained. Probably using Salesforce, probably you are using something else, some third-party integration. Try to get metrics around them also. How are their response time? That is a very key metrics for us. We have some of the stuff that are dependent on them, and when they are out, we look at their metrics. We look at their trend. That gives us some ability that what are the patterns. Okay, during this particular season, Amazon gives this kind of response time. So we should be better prepared for that. So we increase our timeouts and all stuff like that. Log everything. Everything should support. That means it is absolutely not acceptable to have to not have logging, proper logging. That means logging that supports addition, adding that I want to log in syslog, I want to log in this file, or I want to log in that file, or I want to log in a centralized log library, something. So where I want to log and how much I want to log, these two things like log level and priority, it should be available for everything, and it is very easy, pretty much in every frameworks. The smallest tool you write in Python, Ruby, Perl, they comes with, you can have their standard library logging frameworks, right? So logging, metric, and the third part is read and write from some serializable format. It is fine to read from a string or std_in, but start reading or writing in YAML, JSON or some format. If you follow these 3 rules, it is pretty much enough for you to write tools that can be infinitely chainable, right? So for you to start from manual to semi-automatic to automatic mode is not really that hard. Or you can actually use even your POC code. You may argue that the code is really bad, but we know there are standard refactoring techniques, how to address them and all those things. We know that. We have done it for application programming so many years to address them. But these 3 things are golden rule to build any tools. So don't build any tools that does not have this, because they inherently restrict your options or make a dead end. It is very important to have a culture that supports this thing. What does that mean? Everyone is on call. So every time we hired some engineer in PagerDuty, one of our interview deals with outage. What happens with outage? Everybody in their mind should be able to, should be acceptable or should be, fine with being on call. If you have written an application, right, of your team, then probably it is fine, once in a week to you, for you to stay on call. That means if that thing fails, you get called. But yeah, that also means that you instrument alerts and all those things, that only relevant things. If the system disk is full, you don't get called. An application developer does not get called, a system administrator gets called, an operation person. But if a particular failure, a new kind of failure, a new kind of 500 comes, what a typical operation person can do? Probably they can do a lot of stuff, but it is best, the easiest way or the fastest way to fix it to send the alerts to an application developer. So everybody should have that kind of mentality, that we all, it's a shared responsibility, and together we are into this. Second thing is build resiliency on that also. Even if you are on call, what if you are not available? Probably you are busy, probably you are doing something, probably you are driving, right? So you can have multiple layers there also. And you can have that, okay, today I am on call and you are my backup. So if something happens to me, and this is very aggressive. So if I am not picking up, in next 2 minutes it will escalate to you, which is fine. But the next layer is like after 15 minutes. This 2 will give you 80% coverage. And then you rotate, shuffle this. And you do this thing across everything that is end user facing. That is your support, your application development team, your system administration team. Build safety nets, build CI server, build a lot of, make building and practicing this thing cheaper and safer. Anybody should be able to change any code. So in PagerDuty, we can change the web code, or any application we can change drastically, and you can push it and you can see that what fails and how it fails. We can inject failures. So test apps, test infrastructure, test integration. When third-party integration happens, test them also. Finally, inject failures. Things that you cannot really test, right? In production. So we have something called Failure Friday, where every Friday we arbitrarily inject latency. We arbitrarily inject network partition. We put an IP table rule and we say block. This server cannot talk to that server. This can be a webhook implementation, this can be a normal API call, it can be a persistent layer call, it can be a coordination call. We inject and you see how it happens. We do it in the staging, we do it in the UAT, we do it in the dev, and we try to do it in the production also. This gives us some understanding that when it fails, how it looks. Because when we have the outage, we will not know what happened, we will only see the effect. But if we have practiced it, we know probably this component has failed because we have seen this. And this also gives us the ability to reproduce or introduce failure in a controlled environment. So finally, I think my learning from this thing is that failures are inevitable, so accept them. And it's a mindset, it's a totally mindset, right? And it needs to be reflected both in your tools and as well as your organizational culture. Thank you.